Okay, so in the last little lecture, I talked about Hegel's rejection of Kant's view that knowledge is an instrument. And now I want to talk about his rejection of his view that knowledge is a medium. So the idea is this. Hegel says that Kant is assuming this division of reality into phenomena and noumena. He's assuming that on the one hand, we have knowledge down here, cognition, I'll call it knowledge. And on the other hand, we have the object of knowledge up here, the object. For Kant, there is no way to bridge the gap between our cognition of reality and reality itself. Kant calls it the noumena. Hegel refers to it as the absolute. In either case, we're down here. We have a mind. We have knowledge. What do we know? Well, what knowledge is trying to gain is knowledge of reality. Kant says that reality is something the mind can never know. We are cut off for it forever. We cannot bridge the gap between phenomena and noumena. Ultimate reality we're cut off from. We're cut off from God. Kant says we can never know God. We're cut off from free will. We can never know that free will exists. We can never know we have a soul. Ultimate reality, Kant says, we're cut off from, because knowledge is only knowledge of phenomena. The very act of knowing is a filter through which the absolute comes to us, but when there's a filter, you're filtering out the object, you're filtering out that reality. If knowledge is an instrument by which we know this, the object, Hegel says, it will always distort the object, because whenever an instrument hits the object, it distorts it. A hammer will put a little dent in the object that it's hitting. Any instrument will influence the object. So if you want to know reality through knowledge as an instrument, you're never going to know reality. You're only going to know reality as distorted or misshapen by the instrument. So what Hegel says is this: it is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper object matter, namely the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as an instrument, okay, so that's the first thing I talked about, to get hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which it discovers it. I already talked about the idea of knowledge as an instrument. That distorts it. Now let me talk about it as a medium. Think of this. Think of a straw, okay, and this is water. You're looking at a straw in a glass. And so here's the knower out here. We're the knower. This is what we know. This is the known. This is the object of our cognition. When we look at the straw through the medium of the water, the straw is distorted. We do not see the straw as it is in itself. Why is that? Because we only see the straw as mediated through the medium. And water distorts it. That's why it looks like it's bent. Now, one way to compensate for that, if you know the law of refraction, if you know how the degree of refraction, how much that straw has been bent, then you can subtract the difference and then get back to what the straw would have looked like before you saw it in the medium of the water, right? If you know the law of refraction, then from what you see, which is a distorted image of the straw, if you do the mathematical calculations, you could say, oh, okay, I see how much the water has distorted it. Now I could just subtract that distortion and I'll get back to what the straw really looked like. Okay, fine. You could do that. You can subtract, you can, in a sense, compensate for the difference that the water makes, the medium. On the other hand, if you're thinking of knowledge itself, we're not talking about water anymore. We're talking about knowledge itself. So cognition. Now Hegel says Kant is assuming that the object reality that we are looking at through our knowledge through cognition, in this case, the medium through which we are viewing reality it's not water. It's our reason itself. Just as water, any medium will distort the object that you're looking at because you're really not seeing the object. You're seeing the object as it appears through the medium. And you can make up for that difference by subtracting the difference the medium makes. You can't do that in the case of knowledge, because if the medium is knowledge and you subtract knowledge, then you're not going to know anything. You won't have knowledge. So as long as you're thinking of cognition or active reasoning as a medium through which the absolute comes, it reveals itself to us. If there's any separation between the subject down here knowing and the object knowing, if there's any medium at all, you will never know what's up here, because you will only know what's up there as mediated through the medium, which distorts it. So Hegel is going to say what we need to do is to doubt the very act of doubting reason itself. I mean, what Hegel says, here's how he puts it. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error, the reason Kant talks about knowledge as an instrument and knowledge as a medium, and the way Locke too, is because they don't want to be in error. They don't want to be misled by cognition. So first of all, they examine cognition itself. And they say, oh, well, cognition is a medium. Cognition is an instrument. And then they try to say, well, how that distorts reality. And now they say, oh, now we're not going to be deceived, because now we've critically examined knowledge. We've critically examined cognition. We've looked at the instrument. We now know the difference the instrument makes. We now know the difference the medium makes. Now we're critical, and now we can properly understand reality. And when you do that for Kant, you're going to get this split. We can only know the appearances. We can never know reality as it is in itself, independent of an instrument or the medium. Hegel says this: meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, and by science he means simply that our ability to know reality, to construct a valid picture of reality, science. Meanwhile, excuse me, if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of some scruples gets on with the work itself, that's what Hegel wants to do. Let's get on with the work. Let's understand reality. Let's not just focus on the instrument or the medium. Let's actually cognize, understand reality. So meanwhile, the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually cognizes something. It is hard to see why we should not turn round and mistrust this very mistrust itself. And we should not mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether the fear of error is just the error itself? So Hegel is rejecting Kant's assumption that there's a difference between the knower and the known. He says that is an assumption, and we need to doubt the assumption itself. It's not something you could just take for granted, that there is a separation between the knower and the known. This one here, between the subject of the cognition and what is cognized. That's assuming that that knowledge is an instrument, knowledge is a medium. That's an assumption that there's no evidence for that whatsoever. What Hegel says is that the knower and the known are not separated. The knower, the I that knows, is itself is mind. The mind that knows is mental. The mind, the I that knows, is part of what it knows. We are part. Each human being is part of this ultimate reality. Geist. We're not separated from it. So Hegel is saying when we know reality, we are actually knowing reality. We're not simply knowing appearances. That's what for Kant, that's what we are. And for Locke too, if you remember when Locke says, somebody says to Locke, what is a substance? And Locke says, it's something I know not what. So Locke himself, like Kant, is cut off from the world. And the same thing with Descartes. Descartes has the cogito, and then the world is something that he cannot know. It's like, because the evil genius, the evil demon, can be tricking him all the time. So what Hegel is saying is that all of these ways of thinking about the knower and the known, the knower us and reality that we're knowing, are all mistaken, because they all start out from the presupposition that we are down here, the knower and the known are separate, that our mind is separate from ultimate reality. And Hegel's view, as for Parmenides and Spinoza, is that reality is one, and we are part of it. And when we come to know reality, it's reality coming to know itself, because we are part of reality. Our mind is part of this infinite mind. And for Hegel, when the mind knows something, it's knowing what it itself is part of. So that's why I drew a circle here, because the line here represents that there's this radical separation between the mind and what is known. For Hegel, the mind is part of ultimate reality. Being reality for Hegel is rational, and the real is rational, and the rational is real. Our mind is rationality. And our rationality is not cut off from reality. Our rationality is part of the rationality of reality. The real is the rational is the real. That's a Hegelian idea. And reality for Hegel is constantly changing. I mean, the absolute God, for example, can only come to know himself as God through the historical process. It's interesting that in Hegel himself, in Hegel's mind, it's the absolute. It's at that moment when Hegel is thinking that the absolute comes to know itself in history. This actually occurs when Hegel thinks of that idea himself. So when Hegel is thinking of the system, from a Hegelian standpoint, it's the absolute God coming to know himself as God in the very mind of Hegel himself. That's amazing. I mean, whether it's true or not, a lot of people, Schopenhauer, for example, who was a contemporary of Hegel, Schopenhauer thought Hegel was a fraud. One thing about Hegel, his writing is probably the most obscure of any philosopher. Anyway, so there's been a whole lot of debate about Hegel. But anyway, Hegel's writings are full of insight. There's a lot of obscurity in Hegel, but he probably, of all the philosophers in the 19th century, I would think he probably is historically the most influential. And so even though you might be very exasperated reading Hegel, he's worth actually dipping into and spending some time with. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about Hegel for right now.